Hello guys, today I want to tell you about the blue heart of Europe. Growing up in the arid South Texas, John Zablocki saw fresh water as almost magical. As a kid, we used to come up on a cove road just in the middle of brush country, Zablocki sakes, recalling the stock tanks fed by windmill-powered pumps that ranchers use for cattle in remote pastures. And it would be full of amphibians. I still don't know how they got down, but it just ingrained in me the fact that where there's water, there's life. It was with the same sense of wonder that the blocky farmer, director of energy, infrastructure, and land use strategy for the Nature Conservancy in Nevada, first encountered the rivers on southeast Europe while traveling during college. Winding through the Balkan Peninsula, the mountainous region just north of Greece and separated from Italy by the Adriatic Sea. These waterways are among the continent's most intact, having largely escaped the centuries of damming and channeling that has reshaped most rivers throughout the rest of Europe. There's an otherworldliness about them, Zablocki says. That turquoise blue, crystal clear, drinkable water looks like a fantasy. It's no wonder, he knows, that the region has served as a location for film and TV series, including the Chronicles of Narnia and Game of Thrones. But these fantastic rivers face a very real threat. Since the late 1990s, where the Balkans began to move away from aging coal-fired power plants, hydroelectronic developers have proposed thousands of new dams. While shutting down coal plants is a necessary step in the fight against climate change, hydropower has its own downsides, such as altering river flow, which damages irreplicable freshwater, wetland, and riparian habitats. Community groups have succeeded in preventing some projects, occasionally with help from international environmental organizations. But the victories were temporary and the defeats were permanent, says Zablocki, who studied community-based conservation as a Fulbright scholar and at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. Hundreds of dams have already been built, and the proposals are still coming. According to the regional group River Watch, the next few years could see almost 3,000 new hydropower plants across the Balkans, including within the boundaries of national parks. Conservation strategies historically have been terrestrially based, but that's not doing the job, says Amy Nevstock, TNC's Global Freshwater Protection Program advisor. Rivers need our deliberate and focused efforts to protect them too. The plight of this region with freshwater protection advocates have taken to calling the blue heart of Europe is not unique. Worldwide, only 17% of rivers are both free-flowing and within protected areas. Meanwhile, almost a third of freshwater fish are sweetened with extinction, and monitored populations of freshwater wildlife are down an average of 84% since 1970. But the freshwater team at TNC is now working to turn that tide by building a global framework inspired by legislation enacted more than 50 years ago in the United States that can be used to give rivers permanent legal protection. And with some early victories in the Balkans, this new approach is showing signs it could offer big dividends for freshwater habitats around the world. In smaller villages, people are rising up against detrimental development in their local communities, which poses a threat to rivers that were untouched for centuries. In the early 1990s, after a decade of political and economic turmoil, the communist state of Yugoslavia dissolved, leaving a half dozen successor nations beset by their own internal conflicts. Throughout the 1990s, wars flared across the Balkan Peninsula, killing tens of thousands of people and displacing approximately 2 million. Today, the impact of the breakup is still felt in the form of economic development that lags behind the rest of Europe. We are moving on, says Dragna Milesic, TNS Southeast Europe Program Director, who grew up in Belgrade, Serbia, and is now based in Brussels. When you talk to people, they don't live in the past, she says, but the economic situation, that's the legacy of conflict. Catching up economically will require rebuilding the energy sector. Right now, Southeast Europe remains dependent on staggeringly inefficient and dirty fossil fuel plants, most of which date to communist era. A 2019 study by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air found that 18 coal-fired plants in the Western Balkans emitted twice as much sulfur dioxide as 221 coal-fired plants emitted in the European Union. These emissions contribute to notoriously poor air quality in cities like Sarajevo and Belgrade, and a growing concern about the environment. We were taking a lot of what we had for granted. But now, since development is picking up and there are so many new pressures on nature, we are starting to say, okay, we are now really at risk of losing it, so we better do something. Even in smaller villages, people are rising up against detrimental development in their local communities, which poses a threat to rivers that were untouched for centuries. As the rest of Europe moves toward a future that is less dependent on fossil fuels, some countries in the Balkan Peninsula are working to catch up. Given the ecological consequences of damming rivers, wind and solar power will be okay. Until recently, progress was hampered by government subsidies that favored hydroelectric power. Incentives established more than a decade ago, when wind and solar seemed prohibitively expensive. But as technology has improved and economies of scale develop, costs are plummeting, making wind turbines and solar arrays cheaper. In many cases, that coal plants with a lighter environmental impact than hydroelectric power. That shift, combined with growing political awareness surrounding the importance of renewable energy sources, has translated into momentum over the past few years. Serbia now boasts more 400 megawatts of wind power, representing about 5% of its total capacity. Viznovic notes, while Macedonia is installing 100 megawatts of solar on a former coal mine, and all the government are pledging that they will build more, he says. With dozens of plants in the works, the International Renewable Energy Agency predicts that by 2030, solar and wind capacity across the region will approximately triple that it was in 2015. The irony is not lost on local environmental advocates. That's an effort to reduce reliance on fossil fuels is what's treating their rivers. But while hydropower may be an environment improvement, in that way it comes with its own environmental downsides. Damming a river changes it in more ways than might at first be obvious. Above the dam, the ecosystem immediately changes from flowing habitat to still water. Organisms whose life cycles many have once depended on free travel up and down the river and its tributaries are now blocked for their feeding and spawning routes, which can result in population loss. You are isolating a lot of the streams that will normally drain into the rivers, says Jonathan Higgins, TNC's senior freshwater science advisor. That means fish that would normally move from one stream to another get into a reservoir and they don't know where they are. It's almost like they're blind because they don't have a flow to direct their movements. Downriver, the dam prevents seasonal flooding, meaning migratory fish don't receive the full set of environmental cues around which their reproduction evolved. Vegetation that normally thrives in the floodplain dies back, and the system is less able to flush out pollutants. Meanwhile, reservoir water releases can cause a natural temperature gradients, and water flowing through a dam can be oxygen deprived, at times making the river downstream uninhabitable. It's a problem when you are disrupting the natural pulse of the river, Higgins says. There's a chain reaction that extends beyond just the species living underwater. Changing the historic flow of rivers also has an impact on human communities. Changing the historic flow of rivers also has an impact on human communities. Residents of the village of Bratac, Albania, have organized protests to prevent for hydropower dams that will destroy local drought populations. In Vinica, Montenegro, farmers are fighting a dam that would dry out hand-dug irrigation channels their families have used for centuries, while in Temska, Serbia, villagers are working to halt more than 50 hydropower plants proposed for the Temstika River, a hotspot of biodiversity that runs through the national park. Community groups have had some success, but fighting dams one at a time is ultimately a losing proposition. Even when international groups will come in to help fight off a really bad project, the developers could always come back, says Zablocki. If only there were a way to flip it so that defeats were temporary, but victory is permanent. 2 years after returning to the United States in 2010, Zablocki worked on trout conservation in Nevada before joining TNC to lead its programs with the Mojave Desert. Also, he found himself back in the dry American Southwest. The turquoise waters of Southeast Europe were rarely far from his thoughts. He realized that the key to saving them might be found in his home country, where a model for preserving rivers in perpetuity had been in place for half a century. It was an ambitious SAM, but it might help to jumpstart an international effort to save the blue heart of Europe. Signed it into law by President Lyndon Johnson in 1968, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act grew out of an effort to save the flooded river in Montana's Glacier National Park from a proposed hydropower project. The law established a system for permanently protecting America's most beautiful and ecologically important rivers that had been overlooked by previous conservation legislation. Today, it protects 13,000 miles of 226 designated rivers in 41 states and Puerto Rico. It's a relatively small amount of rivers and river miles in comparison to all the rivers in the United States, says Stephen Chesterton, Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager with the U.S. Forest Service. But 1 in 10 people in the country can trace their drinking water to a wild and scenic river watershed. It's not just about the recreational benefits, which you might think of given the name of the program, but the ecological and day-to-day benefits of ensuring clean water. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act represents a major success story in the United States, and Zablocki and his TNS colleagues hoped it could offer a model of Southeast Europe. To showcase the possibilities, they organized a trip for Balkan area conservations and government officials on the banks of one of America's true jewels, a mountain-flanked stretch of the Snake River near Jackson, Wyoming. The September 2018 trip would connect the Europeans to their American counterparts, including representatives from TNC and partner organizations like American Rivers, the Interagency Wild Scenic Rivers Council, and the World Wildlife Fund, giving them a chance to learn about how the United States protects and manages its rivers. Zablocki knew getting everyone together in Wyoming also offered a valuable opportunity to build relationships that would support conservation efforts across international borders. To facilitate bonding, they organized fly fishing lessons, read them at movie at night, and letting the water work its magic, a rafting trip down the majestic Snake. The European delegation set to work in their own countries as soon as they got home, supporting one another and continuing the conservation over WhatsApp. Then, in December 2019, Horvatia announced permanent protection based on a cultural heritage. designation. Okay, guys, that's it for today. Have a nice day and goodbye.